Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. Famed across the ancient world, jealously guarded by private collectors, built up over centuries, then reduced to ashes in a single day. The history of the library is one of ambition, resilience, and sometimes sudden loss. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, a librarian at the Internet Archive. In The Library, A Fragile History, authors Andrew Pettegree and Arthur de Weduwen trace the sweeping arc of libraries across time, from the legendary collections of Alexandria to the public libraries we fight to protect today. Do libraries last? That's one of the questions we'll explore in this episode with historian Abby Smith Rumsey. But first, let's hear from Brewster Kahle, the digital librarian of the Internet Archive, to help set the stage for today's conversation.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, this is a fantasy talk for me. This is not a fanzine of libraries through the ages. This is how did we as people keep information alive over time? And how did it shift? What were the challenges? What went up and what went down? And it's scholarly, but it's still also completely readable. So this talk of having Abby Smith Rumsey, who's a historian in the area of libraries and really understands the history and has worked in this forever, is the perfect person for this. But Andrew and Arthur, I have to just fanboy just for a moment. Thank you for going and pouring. Just every page has got enormous amounts of information. It's just not your business book of mouthing off or just a cocktail table. This is serious work that went into this. And through that, I've discovered all sorts of different libraries. And it's not just the Internet Archive that's under attack right now. It's all libraries that are under attack. So we have to go and learn, what can we learn from history? History may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme, as I believe somebody famous said. It's how do we go and learn from books like yours, from experiences, to go and make it so that the best works of humankind make it over the forces of king and church, of government and corporation, that are the things that tend to sway, smash, obliterate, and give rebirth to our library. So I'm so looking forward to this.
Hi, I'm Dave Hansen. Today we have authors Andrew Pettegree, who is a professor of modern history at St. Andrews University, and Arthur de Weduwen, who is a historian and postdoctoral fellow at St. Andrews. Andrew directs the Universal Short Title Catalog, a database of information about all books published before 1650. He is a leading expert on the history of the book and media transformations, and is the author of several books on the subject. Arthur serves as an associate editor of the Universal Short Title Catalog, and this is his fifth book. They will be joined in conversation today by writer and historian Abby Smith Rumsey. Abby's work focuses on the creation, preservation, and use of the cultural record in all media. She is the author of When We Are No More, How Digital Memory is Shaping Our Future. Abby, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Arthur and Andrew, for writing such a wonderful and engaging book. Congratulations. When I was reading it, raised a number of questions, and I hope they entice the people who have not yet read the book to go out and buy it and spend time with it this summer and beyond. In the beginning of the book, you say, and here I'm quoting you, if there is one lesson from the centuries-long story of the library, it is that libraries only last as long as people find them useful. And then you go on in several hundred pages to talk about the extraordinary variety of uses that people have found for libraries and why they create libraries and why they fall into desuetude for a while, but always come back in some different form. I'm wondering if you can start telling us about some of the uses that you found that was always reinvigorating a library or rebuilding a library. And if there are any that you found particularly persistent or, in fact, unusual.
Well, absolutely. And may I just say thank you, Abby, for hosting this conversation, and for Brewster and Chris for all the organization. It's such a pleasure that we can have a discussion like this about libraries hosted by such a wonderful new and modern library, the Internet Archive, and all that it does. But why do people keep building libraries? I think it's an incredibly What our story, I think, shows is that the desire to collect and organize knowledge is absolutely fundamental to humans, to human behavior. And this is something we see from the very first instances when people are beginning to record information, that they're also trying to collect it in whatever different media forms that might take. That might be clay tablets or papyrus scrolls or parchment codices or on digital platforms. So I think there is just something inherently human about this desire to keep information in some sort of selective, curated space. And I think that's where we see the origins of libraries. And I think that continues to be one of the key drivers of library building. But what we emphasize in our story is that the usefulness of knowledge, what type of information or knowledge is useful to be kept, that is one of the key drivers of library growth as much as library destruction. That's why people continue after every sort of movement of intellectual upheaval, whether that's the Reformation or the Enlightenment. People wish to build libraries anew because they weren't satisfied with the libraries they already had. And so I think that is an overarching stimulant of libraries that you will continue to see in every human generation. It creates a sort of cycle of growth and dispersal that I don't think we can truly ever escape.
I was to choose one theme, I would have also chosen what Arthur has to say about this cycle of growth, decay, rebuilding, reorganization. But there's one other key theme I want to raise at this point, and that is power disguised as altruism. We see that all the way through the history of libraries, from the Roman Empire to the great libraries of the manuscript era, even into the public library movement. I think it's very important for us to understand in our discussion of the fate of the library today that the public library as we know it has occupied a vanishingly small part of library history. Really only from about 1890 to 1970 was a public library a central institution in library culture. But what tends to happen is that a lot of libraries are built by great men wanting to impress their friends and wanting to be seen to impress their friends by ordinary citizens. So until the 19th, 20th century, the idea of building libraries for the entire population was very restricted. And then it was even harder to get to people, the creators of those libraries, to allow the people who used them to have agency in the choice of books. The desire of librarians to shape people's choices continued well into the 20th century, and I think was only really compromised when the paperback movement of the mid-20th century gave so many consumers the choice to bypass libraries if they wished, and finally persuaded librarians that patrons had to have agency in the choice of their books.
Yes, I think one of the fascinating things about the book for me is the way the uses keep growing over time. Arthur, you started with the ideal of the library, which is to collect and preserve knowledge. But in fact, some of the most, I think, novel parts of the book for me were, frankly, the parts that all librarians really know, which is that it's a human activity filled with vanity and competition. And I think that's one of the things, the vanity and competition goes way back to the very beginning. And I think from my own experience continues into collection development today. And that's one of the things about the book that I think is unique. It's not romantic about how libraries are built, nor how they're destroyed. Now, one of the pivot points you talk about in the history of libraries is, of course, the invention of printing. And you say that it changes not only libraries, but of course, naturally changes society. But you also point out early on that although other civilizations were exposed to or themselves invented printing long before the Europeans, it was only the Europeans that really took it up and amplified it for the first 3 centuries. And I'm wondering if you could talk about why they did that and other countries did not, and then what role it played in how Europe and the West began to distinguish itself from other parts of the world.
It's perfectly fair to say that there have been experiments with the technology of printing, particularly in Asia, which predate the successful experiment with printing with movable type in Europe by many centuries. On the other hand, there's more to printing than technology. And what you also have to have is scale in terms of a distribution network, in terms of production, and in terms of audience. And this is why Europe, in the end, won out, because Europe had a concentration of urban communities, and it was mostly in the cities that readers were concentrated by the 15th century. And it also had a distribution network through the trade passing between Italy and Germany and France and the Netherlands. So you have in the center of Europe a critical mass of consumers and producers able to find the investment to produce books in editions of up to 1,000 copies. And that's what really differentiates it from the Asian print cultures, that you get editions of considerable size. And there's not much evidence of that from the Far East. They don't have a concentrated population. They don't have the levels of literacy required to printing. And most of all, Europe conquered in terms of the printing experiment because of the Roman alphabet, 3 characters. So you don't need a huge character set to be designed for books to print. And of course, we know that, for instance, in China, the character set is so much more sophisticated, so much larger, that it actually impeded the rapid growth of printing.
We can tie this nicely too with your point about competition, Abby, which I think is a very pertinent one. This sense that we see very early on in Europe that book collecting is incredibly rivalrous activity. And some of the greatest libraries of the first age of printing are being built precisely because a prince is looting someone else's library and carting it off wholesale as a war trophy. Whether that's Swedish armies in Germany or Poland, or Catholic princes against Protestant ones. And this, in some ways, also carries through when Europeans go out of Europe and begin the construction of colonial empires. Famously, one of the early acts of the Spanish conquistadors in Mexico was to ensure the destruction of Aztec books, which looked very different to European books, but were nevertheless recognized as a sort of a dangerous tool of resistance. And so that also ties into the issue of what has survived and how well different book media last. European parchment and early paper, which were the two means of producing printed books, with paper really rapidly winning out, is incredibly durable. So if you hold in your hands a book from 16th century Europe, very often is in far better shape than a cheap paperback or a print-on-demand book that's being produced today, because this is serious sort of durable paper made from rags. So this is a book that's stored in the right conditions, can survive another 1,000 years. Whereas if you think, for example, of most books that were being produced in ancient Egypt to belong in the famous Library of Alexandria, these were written on papyrus scrolls. Now, papyrus scrolls are incredibly cheap to produce, especially in an abundant region where you have lots of papyrus, but they also degrade very quickly. So even if no one had ever actually destroyed the ancient Library of Alexandria, it would have probably disintegrated within 200 or 300 years if every scroll had not constantly been recopied. So the choice of different and the availability of different media also play into the story of what became the dominant form of bookmaking and book collecting that now survives in what is a very global, interlinked world.
So you just brought up the question of technological refresh, which we think about a lot in the digital world, but of course has been there from the very beginning. Arthur, you mentioned something about war, and one of the things that I found most, in some ways, surprising, or I think most people would find very surprising, is when you talk about war, of course, you document the destruction that goes on in war, but you also make a very powerful point that war actually stimulates interest in libraries and reading. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how wars and the effort to raise morale among people and give access to books happens during war at the same time that we see so much destruction.
It's an excellent question, Abby, but I'm going to leave this one to Andrew.
Oh, thanks, Arthur. And yes, that chapter that we wrote on war was a journey of discovery for both of us. And what it taught me was that I wanted to write more about this, and specifically about the harm books do, not only because they are harmed, but also because they are the carriers of the ideologies which incubate war in the first place. It's no accident that dictators are themselves great admirers of libraries. Adolf Hitler almost doubled the public library network in Germany between 1933 and 1939 and ensured they had, from his point of view, the right books to create an atmosphere supportive of war in Germany. The other war leaders, interestingly, the Second World War is the first war fought between best-selling authors. Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Hitler sold 9 million copies of Mein Kampf. Stalin was a published poet at the age of 19. And of course, Mao Zedong produced the greatest of all bestsellers in Mao's Little Red Book. So these were people who understood the power of words. Now, what you find in wartime, in response to your question, is some people read a great deal more and some people read a great deal less. For instance, in the Second World War, domestic servants in Europe were all drawn into war industries. So a lot of women who had relied on having help in the house to make time for their reading no longer had that time. They also had volunteer activities which they performed for the war effort. On the other hand, many people who found themselves away from home, let's say troops on active service, or people who had been drawn into war work which required them to live in digs, they had more time for reading. And there were some spectacular innovations in the book industry to help these out. And of course, the people who were most dependent of books of all were prisoners of war who had endless time and nowhere they could go. So they became the war's great readers.
I found myself without access to materials. I did what I expected, which is I revisited the library that I had been building for many years with great delight and discovered things that I had read before and things that I bought and intended to read but hadn't. And there was something that resonated about this in your book, which is that no matter the level of destruction, the scale of destruction, that what is left, humans always find a way of making meaning out of what is left. So I'm wondering if you had some sense, after all the work you put into this and synthesizing all of the research, of what you think are the most devastating kinds of threats. What are the kinds of losses that are very difficult to recover from? I'm thinking specifically of the library in Belgium, the Louvain Library, which was destroyed twice in war and then rebuilt twice. But then you say, actually, the greatest devastation to it was after the rebuilding, the government had actually split the library in two and it lost its coherence. So I'm wondering if you can say some things about the value of integrity of a collection, but also what happens when only a little bit survives and people have to make the best of that.
Well, the Louvain was even worse than that, because the only way that the two parts of Belgium could agree on how it was split was that one took the odd numbers and the other took the even numbers in every collection. So you go to work in one and you find, they say, oh, sorry, that's an odd number. So you imagine if something's in two parts, might be in part one is in one library and part two in the other. So it was rather ridiculous. I'm rather an optimist because the sort of cataclysmic events which impact libraries are in the longer term actually less damaging to collecting than the everyday. The problem with books is that the books are most likely to survive if they're not much used. They go into libraries, they sit there for 400 pages. We've gone in for 400 years. Maybe we've gone into libraries when we were working in France, where just by the way, the spine cracked when you opened it. You realize that nobody had that book open for maybe since the French Revolution, which is why it came into the hands of the public library then. And then when you open the pages, they can be pristine. And in those days, when people were using their books, they wrote in them. So you know that's basically a book that has survived through a lack of use. And our job as scholars, working with this project we have called the Universal Short Title Catalogue, which is trying to document every book that ever was in the first age of print, is that the books that were most used catechisms, prayer books, songbooks, almanacs are used to death. And sometimes the printer would have printed 1,000 copies and not a single one survives today, which is why you then have to go to book catalogs, sales catalogs, auction catalogs of people's private collections, and then compare what's in those with what we have from surviving libraries, and you find an awful lot of books which can't be documented except through these references. So that's what we're up to at the moment.
Yes, I would add to that to say that I guess one of the ultimate threats, and I don't see it going away, is the sense that the more we move on in time, I have a feeling that every generation has a sense of the accumulated knowledge that they have and the new knowledge they're adding to it. But that's the best they've ever had. And that there is a sense that the knowledge we have now is better than what was before. But no generation knows what people in the future will value in terms of knowledge. Obviously, you can have a guess, you can have an idea, you can have a go, but there is no sense of knowing what someone in 100 years' time or 200 years' time will value of what we're doing now. And so this issue of a lack of understanding of the future, it can be terrible for library culture because we may be spending all our time collecting things that won't be of value to future societies, which we just don't know. And I think we see a lot of that with the rise of digital information, where I think so much early on was lost or is not being systematically collected that perhaps should be. And obviously with the creation of things like the Wayback Machine, that is a great advancement because it's exactly trying to plan all that future of saying we should be able to retrieve again what was once very ephemeral information. And I think if you see something, it's the production of ephemeral information, which has rarely made it into libraries. So perhaps that is now beginning to change. But this continues to be a debate, and you see it here in the UK, for example, with discussion of how government stores information. And if much of government business is being done on encoded private WhatsApp messages, then you're dealing with a very different situation from government in the past, where you had neatly printed minutes that someone can lock in an archive and then unlock in 70 or 80 years' time. So this will continue to be a challenge, I think.
Yeah, you're talking about neglect being a great threat. Also, biblioplasm, that is the desire to ban books and burn books. And this is a very hot topic in the States now, given where we are. So people are curious about what has happened in the past and how people have recovered, cultures have recovered from periods of book banning, censorship, and
Very good question. Again, I think it's a very human trait to wish to destroy other people's books that you don't agree with or that are a threat to your ideology or your confession. So this is something as old as libraries are, I'm afraid. In some ways, there is the sort of wholesale destruction you saw with the Aztecs by the Spanish, that you see with Jewish library culture in the Second World War. I think the advent of printing has enabled much more printed matter to survive even some horrendous purges of literature, because the sheer number of copies out there is very difficult to destroy. Also, the advent of personal collecting, of private collecting, is a immense safeguard against biblioclasm. If you consider that, say, in Nazi Germany, it's very easy to go for the authorities to go to every single public library and retrieve every single copy of a book by an author that they don't agree with. It's much more difficult to go into private homes and ferret out where people hide their books and make sure you have every single copy of a particular item. So personal collecting has always played a major role in preventing biblioclasm. I would also say that in general, throughout history, efforts of censorship, very overt censorship, often backfire because it causes notoriety and it makes people aware of books they didn't even know existed. In fact, I know of one marvelous quote from a Dutch statesman in the 17th century who's had a complaint by a Calvinist minister who said, "This new book has appeared and we urge you that you issue laws to ban this and that all copies are confiscated and burned." And the statesman just said, "I can see why you'd want to do that, but I'm afraid that if we do that, everyone will want to buy a copy." So I think the safest thing is just to ignore the book and hope it goes away.
Yes, I agree with Arthur about private collecting. That's, I suppose, the most distinctive feature that we brought to this book, that instead of looking only at institutional collections, we regard private collecting as the savior of book culture through several key moments of its development. When we wrote a book together before on the book culture of the 17th century Dutch Republic called The Bookshop of the World, what really fascinated me was the idea that a professor in a university, someone like me, could actually have more books in their private collection than a university library. And that seems so much the reverse of what you expect, because institutional libraries were struggling then. So when you get attacks on institutions, as we've discussed, you don't necessarily get to the heart of the book world. What I'd also say is that when we're dealing with public libraries, and indeed the production of books more generally, I think it's true that all societies agree that there are limits to the permissible. I can't think of any society through history that really favored the complete freedom without limits on the sort of things that should be put into the public. So although censorship is a dirty word, nevertheless, there is a certain social consensus behind certain elements of censorship. Now, I think where we've seen a change, at least as far as public libraries are concerned, is that in the past, it used to be the librarians who were the gatekeepers of propriety and also chose what they thought would be good for their patrons to read. Now, the pressures for exclusion tend to come not from the librarians, but from the patrons. And I think that is a really significant change in the United States in the last 30 years. And I think we're moving one step further even, where we're now getting to the stage where not only are people disapproving of content, but also disapproving of books because of the character of the authors who wrote them. That actually is not all that new. Howard Fast, for instance, the author of Spartacus, he was a strong supporter of the Communist Party in the post-war period, so he couldn't find a publisher for his book, and so had to publish it himself because no firm would touch it because of who he was rather than the contents of the book.
You mentioned the role of private collecting and how it saves many things that otherwise would be lost. And I did find that one of the most fascinating parts of the book, consistent theme throughout the book. But particularly, it grows with the change in technology. But now we're at another pivot point of technology when people are accessing things primarily through electronic sources. And it raises this question, which I know concerns the archive a lot, which is, what is the role of private collecting in a digital world in which ownership of books actually is moot? So it's one thing to to use ABE books during the COVID lockdown. And 50 years hence, what will be the equivalent of the public library in the secondhand book market?
Yeah. The first book I wrote which touched on this subject was my book on the transition from manuscript to print, the book in the Renaissance. And what you found is that era, like our own, was filled with false prophecy. People who supported printing supported it for reasons which was not what printing became. Humanist scholars wanted more books to themselves. They didn't necessarily want pamphlets being spread around the cities of Germany supporting Martin Luther. It was impossible to tell how the market would develop. And certainly that's been true of the digital age too. That people have been trying to write the obituary of the book, the physical book, now for the best part of 100 years. And still it goes on because it has proved to be such an adaptable technology. What I think is the greater truth from the history of communication is that the history of communication is cumulative rather than sequential. Because we have a new communication medium, we don't give up the old. For instance, when people learned to write, they didn't stop talking. When people got print, they didn't stop using manuscripts. When people have got digital, they haven't abandoned print. And the aspect of this we haven't discussed at all yet is the bookshop and the extent to which bookshops are today providing many of the functions which libraries had previously. For instance, randomness. If I go into a bookshop, the likelihood is, and that's new bookshop or second-hand bookshop, the likelihood is I will go out with a book I'd never heard of before I went in. Whereas to some extent, digital is encouraging, admittedly with a huge library, it's encouraging focus searches. And that's why I think libraries may have a future for the randomness of discovery.
I fully agree with Andrew. And I think we can be reasonably optimistic that the physical book will continue to be around and to thrive and to play a role in both personal collections, that people will continue to want to have books, and not just as a fantastic reading format, but because it looks good on the shelf. Also because unlike with ebooks, you actually own the thing. You're not just owning a license to read it on someone's platform. And once you have a book, it doesn't require any other costs. But one of the great challenges in the next century, I think, will be energy and electricity. And I think, at least I hope, that public library systems won't be abandoning the physical book entirely, because we cannot be certain that if we only begin to store knowledge and information electronically, that it will be around forever. And I think that the book, certainly the codex, has proved to be a pretty durable form of information storage. It's been around for a good 2 millennia at least. And it's also just a wonderful means of reading. And I don't see that going away. So I'm optimistic.
People are making some very pertinent points. They're pointing out that you don't necessarily own an ebook when you think you've published it. It is in license. You can't lend it to anybody, which is one of the great pleasures of book ownership. And I don't underestimate display. One of the great things with being a professor is that your students automatically assume that you've read all the books around you. And if they knew how far from the truth this was, they'd be very disappointed. So I never pointed out to anyone. But digital is based on taking a real punt on some things which don't look likely to me. At the moment, digital is entirely reliant on a reliable source of electricity. Now, since the Ukraine war started, we've learned in parts of Europe just how that cannot be taken for granted. And there are already parts of the world where 2 hours electricity a day is as good as it gets. Now, British universities are betting big on digital. And of course, there's huge advantages for students and academics. You have access to many more titles, and sometimes often very rare titles as well. So it's a great opportunity. But you don't want to be throwing away your physical backstops, because there may come a day when the lights go out and people will be clamoring at the door of my office, holding their candles, saying, have you got any of those things people used to call books?
You mentioned self-publishing now, and what is the history of that? I mean, I know that, for example, the great Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had to publish everything himself because nobody understood what he was saying, and certainly nobody wanted to buy the book. And I think Herman Melville also had to fund his own publications at some point. So what is the longer history of self-publishing, and what do you think the future of that will be?
I would say self-publishing has absolutely been integral to the art of publishing since it's been around, from the very earliest days of manuscript books, where in their very nature, it was often if an author wanted to circulate a manuscript in more than a single copy, they would be themselves responsible often for producing those copies or hiring as prescribed to do, and then passing them around to friends, or potentially dedicating and presenting it to a patron in hope of financial reward. And even when printing came about, it was a sort of invention hailed by authors all across Europe, because they all thought, finally, we can have all our works published now. And then came the disappointment when commercial publishers decided, actually, I'm not going to print your Neo-Latin poem in 500 copies. I don't think this is going to sell at all. And actually, authors found that very often, in order to get their work out, they would have to be partially or wholly financially responsible, and basically pay a printer and then either distribute the copy to booksellers or distribute them themselves. And I think in the history of publishing, we're so consumed by the great figures, by someone like Erasmus or Luther, who sold millions of copies, produced so many works that were published all over Europe, that we think that's the norm. But I think actually behind the sort of the title pages of a book where you have a printer's name, it's often the author who's lurking with the money. that made it possible in the first place. So this continues. And like you cited yourself, Abby, some luminary names who only could get into publishing by starting out doing it themselves. And today, the means for people to self-publish have grown. So I think it will continue to play a pretty significant part. And it's still often the case that self-publishing can lead to major commercial deals. The likes of Stephanie Meyer of the super commercially successful Twilight series started out with essentially self-publishing her works on a blog. Those options are there for everyone.
Yeah, when we think that Ariosto's Orlando Furioso was self-published, he had to pay for the entire edition and then, in essence, hawked it around the courts of Europe, selling it to different customers. That's supposed to the ubiquity of open access to self-publishing. This is extremely popular with older people who want to publish, in effect, a memoir or an autobiography. Now, I can see that would be very attractive, but the role of publishers now, in a way, is very largely that of distribution and sales. And I know from the publisher here in the UK, Profile, how much effort they put into ensuring that this book had got publicity and became known and was stocked in bookshops. It was extraordinary as a historian of the book world to watch the effort going into that process. And I think you can find odd examples of people who self-published and achieved that sort of resonance. But I think it's a vanishingly small number compared to the number of authors who get their break through conventional publishing.
I congratulate you both and recommend the book highly for anybody who wants to know about the past, the present, or the future of libraries, which are, in fact, not so fragile. So thank you very much.
A big thank you to Abby Smith Rumsey, to Andrew Pettegree, and Arthur DeVetto for sharing your story, for guiding us through such a fantastic conversation and letting us know about the durable history of libraries, fragile though they are. Thank you all, and have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.